Of the Second World War, this mission remains the most decorated of them all, a mission that should never be forgotten. 666, this was the tail number of a cursed B-17E flying fortress that ended up facing 17 Japanese Zeros and surviving to tell the tale. This B-17E specifically was the most heavily armed bomber within the Pacific. It was a one of a kind, upgunned massively. You could call it the AC-130 of World War II. The Medal of Honor, which is the highest, most prestigious personal military decoration, was also awarded to the crew for taking part in this incredibly dangerous mission. Nobody expected this outcome or for anyone to make it out alive. Originally, the bomber was called Lucy, the cursed bomber, part of the 33rd. Having the number 666 on the tail, most crews never wanted to fly it because they had thought that it would bring bad luck. It was a neglected bomber that always remarkably managed to return home heavily shot up. It had a bad reputation within the pilots. Damaged and worn out, it was towed to the end of the airfield in Port Moresby, New Guinea, to be taken apart for parts and scrap. Little did anyone know, this bomber was about to make history. Jay Zima and his crew lacked discipline. They didn't always follow the rules and regulations, and so they were always at the bottom of the list when it came to new equipment, such as the B-17s. Jay Zima and his crew volunteered to carry out a photo reconnaissance mission, but he didn't have a plane for the job. He had come upon a military photographer who had told Jay Zima that there was this old B-17 that had been left for parts and scrap at the bottom end of the airfield. This was Lucy, or old 666. The B-17E was in very bad condition, no longer airworthy, and the tail number 666 of course gave it a bad reputation within the crews. With no other options, Jay Zima and his crew took Lucy back from the bottom end of the airfield, upgunned it like no other B-17 of the war, and fixed its damage enough for it to become airworthy again. Nobody wanted to go along with Jay Zima and his crew on his mission, as it was far too dangerous. No fighter at the time had the 600-mile range that this cursed B-17 would travel. They did what they could to upgrade the flying fortress to make up for the lack of friendly escorts or other B-17s. The standard B-17E had 13 50 caliber machine guns. At the waist of the bomber, where you would find two single mount 50 cals, they were upgraded to dual mount 50 cals, doubling the waist guns. The bombardier had also been given his own 50 caliber machine gun to operate. B-17 bombers never had any offensive weapons, only defensive, but this B-17 was fitted with a nose mounted 50 cal machine gun, which could be operated by the pilot himself. Just like a fighter, Lucy had a total of 19 50 caliber machine guns. This is an additional 6 over the usual B-17E flying fortress, making it the most heavily armed flying fortress of the war. It was the 16th of June 1943. Jay Zima and his 8 crew set off without any escorts. They flew over 600 miles to the Solomon Islands, controlled by the Japanese, to identify how strong the Japanese army was, and to set out locations for invasions on the island of Buko and Bougainville. They had completed most of the mission successfully, but with just 22 minutes remaining, things started to go wrong. The crew had already photographed roughly 127 miles along the coast. The Japanese had seen the B-17 and sent up 17 Zeros to attack the flying fortress. Jay Zima had seen the Japanese fighters, but knew that the date set for the land invasion was the 1st of November. He could have easily turned around and fled home, but he pushed on with the mission with his 8 men so that the future invasion could take place. They had all the necessary photos. The 17 Japanese Zeros surrounded the old 666, keeping out of 50 cal range as they planned a coordinated attack. Little did they know the B-17 had been upgunned massively on the front. One Zero started a frontal attack on the flying fortress to serve as a distraction. This was the first Zero that was shot down with the new frontally mounted fixed offensive 50 cal machine gun within the nose. A 50 cal round had hit the fuel tank of the Japanese Zero and it was engulfed in flames. The second Zero that was taken down was with the newly mounted 50 cal machine gun for the bombardier. This Zero was coming in at an angle that the fixed mount 50 cal couldn't reach. However, the bombardier, Joe Sarnowski, managed to clip the wings of the Zero, sending it into a flat spin. Distracted, the crew didn't realize that there was another Zero behind them. This Zero had 20mm cannons, thought to have been using high explosive rounds, and started pelting the B-17. J. Zemo, the pilot, even though he didn't take a direct hit from the 20mm guns, he had been heavily wounded due to shrapnel. For the bombardier Joe Sarnowski, it was much worse. The glass covering the front of the flying fortress had entered his abdomen. He had started losing blood and was checked by the navigator to ask if he was alright. Joe did not reply and was determined to get back to his gun. He continued to fire until he bled out. At this point, the B-17 was completely surrounded. Its hydraulics had been taken out and its rudder had no control. All of the frontal guns had been damaged and were no longer functional. Worse, the crew's oxygen supply, which allows them to breathe at high altitudes, had been shot out. The B-17 dived down in under a minute, from 25,000 to 8,000 feet, to allow the crew to breathe. Old 666 had been in a dogfight with these Zeros for almost an hour by this point. Both the Zeros and the B-17 were running low on ammo, not that the Japanese or the Americans knew. One thing the Flying Fortress still had over the Zeros was fuel. Eventually, the Zeros pulled off. Knowing that his crew would be safe, J. Zemo, wounded, gave up the controls to the B-17. Heavily damaged and torn up, Old 666 headed back to the closest friendly airfield in Dobodero, New Guinea. With a difficult landing at the airfield, the Flying Fortress and its battered crew, without any assistance, had just survived 17 enemy Japanese fighters. The reconnaissance mission was a success. However, it wasn't without casualties. The bombardier, Joe Sarnowski, had bled out and died. J. Zemo, the original pilot, was thought to be dead upon landing, but with medical assistance he lived to tell this tale. It was calculated that the B-17 had been hit by 187 rounds of ammunition from the Japanese Zeros, leaving the bomber with entire sections missing. The plane took off with 9 crew. It returned with 6 heavily wounded and 1 dead. J. Zemo, for bringing back his battered plane and his crew after surviving something that was unheard of, was awarded the Medal of Honor, the highest, most prestigious personal military decoration given for acts of valor. Joe Sarnowski, the bombardier, even though he had died later on, during the battle, heavily wounded, still tried to get back to his 50 caliber machine gun and fired till he had bled out. Therefore, he was also awarded the Medal of Honor. The rest of the crew received the Distinguished Service Cross, the second highest personal military decoration, for extreme gallantry and risking their lives during combat. Of the Second World War, this mission remains the most decorated of them all, and should never be forgotten. If you want to see more B-17 stories, check out my video on the crewless B-17 Ghost Fortress that landed itself. Subscribe if you would like to see more.